Hi everyone, Kartik Krishnaiyer here again for the Florida Squeeze. And I left some of y'all who watched the video on Canada and Canadian tourism to Florida hanging last week as we were overcome by events. But I wanted to describe again why I feel like there is no real option or alternative for Florida to offset Canadian tourism and Canadian investment from abroad. So what I've heard from leaders, in both parties, obviously this is more of a Republican problem because they govern Florida, right, and have had control of the state for almost 30 years now. Complete control of the state since 1998, and partial control after 1992. Right, with various houses of the legislature, and they finally won the governorship in 98 and took full control. They've had what we call the trifecta since 1998. That we can offset the loss of investment and loss of tourism from Canada with tourism and investment from Latin America. Now, first off, you don't have the levels of disposable income and quite the middle class in any Latin country that you do in Canada. You don't have those people who plan to take 1 or 2 week vacations during seasonal periods. In the case of Canadians coming somewhere, it would be in the summer. For Latins coming to Florida, it would be particularly if they're from south of the equator, if they're from the southern area of South America, which is actually probably the wealthier area. Argentina, Brazil, southern Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. You don't have as many middle-class people or as many middle-class people with disposable incomes that are going to be willing to do that. Secondly, you're talking about also trying to offset the loss in real estate, the loss in seasonal rentals, the loss in sort of that market, which I don't think gets offset by Latin Americans. Now, there are wealthy Latinos, Latin Americans, who have invested in condo properties in Brickell, in Aventura, Turnberry Isle, parts of Broward County for years and years and years, and some in the Orlando area. Lake Nona, notably, there's a lot of wealthy Brazilians investing there. The new development just south of Orlando International Airport, which was developed by Joe Louis and his companies. But it doesn't offset a loss in Canadians coming to Florida by any stretch of the imagination. Now you have the very obvious cultural issue, and I'm always careful with this, particularly around people on the left, because they get very sensitive about identity in conversations about race and ethnicity. But quite frankly, Anglophone and Francophone Canadians, like a lot of the investment in Broward County specifically, is from Francophone Canadians, but they assimilate a little more seamlessly in parts of Florida outside of Miami and parts of Broward County, parts of Orange County than people from Latin America. They kind of are more comfortable culturally. They mix in better culturally. Then you also have the issue of the Trump administration and the Trump administration's perceived hostility to people of color. Now, whether they're really hostile to people of color or not, I'm not on the far left on this issue at all. In fact, I've noted to Democrats who like to point out how racist Trump is that he's gotten a bigger percentage of the minority vote running for president than any Republican since Richard Nixon. And actually, since Richard Nixon lost in 1960, he's gotten a higher percentage than Nixon got in 68 and 72 when he won. So the highest percentage of the minority vote in 60 years, basically, he's been getting in 16, 20, and 24. Higher than Romney, higher than McCain, higher than W either time. Well, in terms of the African-American vote, higher than W, not necessarily his Latino vote. Although this time, yes, in 24, but not necessarily in 16 and 20. So, and of the Asian American vote, he's got the highest percentage since Bob Dole, 96. So there was a move of Asian Americans to the Democrats, and now they're kind of shifting back. Muslim Americans, we've talked about, right? Highest percentage since Dole in 96 as well. So, Arab Americans, I should say. So I don't think Trump is necessarily as racist as Democrats think he is. However, the perception abroad is that he is. Okay, I can tell you that flat out from traveling abroad during both of Trump's terms. I've tried to correct the record. I've done my duty as an American trying to correct the record. But I believe that perception really extends to Latin America. And I find that in my own work in football, in soccer. I call it football, but soccer, as it's known here in the States, that there is a perception in Latin America that the United States is more hostile, more racist. So that, while that doesn't affect necessarily the bourgeois in these Latin countries, Latino countries, it does affect the middle class, the smaller middle class, and the working class. So I don't expect those people to vacation in the United States, and I certainly don't expect them to buy property in the United States. So we have a problem. We flat out have a problem. And I think Florida itself reaching out to Canadians, and I've actually heard anecdotal evidence of how if you're from Florida, you get harassed now north of the border, which isn't good. But all of this needs to be solved for our own economic well-being here in Florida.